I'm delighted as Chairman of Cityforum, my name is Mark Lee, to welcome you to this opening conclave at the start of the Reimagining Security and Resilience project we are arranging between now and the end of the year. We work with a number of government organisations, the NSA in Washington, the Cabinet Office here, the National Police Chiefs Council here, and many others. But we're particularly delighted to have an association with ZN, a truly important research and advisory organisation in the City of London, which was originally founded by Michael Manelli, who is due to become Lord Mayor very shortly. Our work with ZN has been fascinating over the years, and we're particularly pleased to have these positioning webinars, which traditionally start these programs and are very helpful in developing ideas which we build on during the course of the period when we work these programs up. Ian Aitchison is chairing as an associate of ZN and a great authority on matters maritime and shipping, and significant areas for this particular piece of work. I'm especially pleased to invite into the conversation Frank Kramer and Madeleine Moon, who've done brilliant work for us in the sort of past and make these events run perfectly. We have a new panelist from a part of the world from which I've never invited anybody ever, in the shape of Dorothy Wickham from the Solomon Islands, and we hope very much that she'll be able to sort of join us for this sort of conversation, because her views on climate and its effects on her society, her views on sea level rises, and upon all the communications issues which Frank and others will be speaking about, will be enormously interesting to have them. Dorothy hadn't sort of come into the conversation when we began, but we hope that she will be able to join us. And Ian, you'll bring her in when you sort of can. The resilience work we've done has been of great interest to us, and anybody who is listening in to this webinar today who is interested either institutionally or individually in working with us on this series, we should be delighted to have you join us. Ian, thank you very much for sharing and for, I'm sure, ably filling the shoes of Michael Manelli, who can't be with us today. But thank you very much for doing it, and thank you, ZN, for all your help in running these webinars. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, a very exciting start to series of resilience, perhaps something that we need to think more about in the bigger picture. And I should just add that this is the start of a series. The next one came up will be on infrastructure, and that, I believe, on the 12th of June. But today we're thinking about preparing for and responding to threats to resilience. And as Mark said, this is the first discussion in the Cityforum, Reimagining Security and Resilience project. Today, as Mark mentioned, we're joined by Franklin D Kramer, a distinguished fellow and board director of the Atlantic Council. Mr. Kramer has served as a senior politician and appointing two administrations, including as Assistant Secretary of Defence for International Security Affairs. And Franklin, we welcome you here today. We hope to be joined by Dorothy Wickham. She's a local journalist who's worked for the media industry in the Solomon Islands for the last 30 years, and indeed is joining us, we hope, from the Solomon Islands today. So we hope we'll see her shortly joining us. She's written for various international news organisations. Another panelist today is Madeleine Moon, who's represented the Bridgend constituency at Westminster from 2005 to 2019. She joined the Defence Select Committee in 2009 and chaired subcommittees reporting on the safety and welfare of military personnel, on training and exercises, the use of remotely piloted air systems, something probably highly relevant today, and defence of the Arctic, again, a very topical issue today. Madeleine was a member of the UK delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly from 2010, serving as member for Defence and Security Committee, and was elected president in November 2018. So some distinguished panellists today. I myself, I'm managing director of Scotch Communications. It's my pleasure to chair it today, I have some background in the Royal Navy at one point, so interest in civilians, in resilience comes from there. But wait a minute, go any further. Let's get on to get out the way and throw it open to our panel. I'll remind the agenda here, and we'll have a 20-minute question and answer. You can put that in the chat function to do that, and the Q&A function. There is a chat function there too. So please go to the chat function of the questions to put them in, so I can feed them in later. But I think what we're going to hand over to is just a quick introduction from our speakers today. And perhaps I can start then with Frank, with yourself, some opening remarks.
Thanks very much, Ian, and good morning, Madeleine. A pleasure to be with you again today. So as I think about preparation and responding to threats to resilience, I think a reasonable framing point is to recognize that the transatlantic nations, and I would expand that to the what I might call the advanced democratic economies in the Indo-Pacific, so Japan, South Korea, Australia, that each of those nations actually is a fairly resilient nation, in fact, although we have multiple challenges. And it's useful to, I think, look quickly back and realize, for example, that Europe as a whole has dealt very well with the cutoffs and limitations on Russian hydrocarbons. Obviously difficult, but adequately dealt with. Same with respect to dealing with the COVID pandemic. The vaccines were developed very, very quickly. The rollout was reasonable, obviously not perfect, a lot to learn about how to deal with a pandemic. But again, it was a resilient response. And then maybe a third area would be terrorism, certainly since 9/11 or even before. Obviously still an issue, but it's one that's significantly constrained. So I think we should start with the notion that both the governments and the societies have a basis for thinking that they can be resilient. And then as we think about where we really need to go, what are the fundamental challenges? I would say there are three, at least from my perspective, that are the most important. The first, which you've already referenced, Ian, is climate. Climate change is going to require a lot of change on our part, changes to multiple economic sectors, energy, agriculture, transportation, manufacturing. So a huge set of issues in front of us. Secondly, I think we have to think about information age, we're in the information age, and the vulnerabilities that has created. We've developed a lot of really very substantial capabilities, but mostly they were put in place without thinking about the vulnerabilities that came along with that. So there's the cybersecurity set of issues, technological, but there's also what you might think about, or one might think about, is disruptive influence operations. We've seen countries adversarial countries try to affect our democracies, affect our elections and the like. And so we need to think about both the technological and the informational vulnerabilities with respect to information technology. And the third major effort, I would say, is what I would call the generally adversarial approach of China under Xi Jinping. We have a lot of challenges there. China presents a challenge to market economies. It itself is a state-driven economy utilizing a huge amount of subsidies for their companies. There are risks of supply chain dependencies, such as rare earths or computer assemblies. The Chinese undertake substantial cyber and human espionage, and that affects both national security and market competitiveness. So from a broad perspective of those challenges, I think the success requires us to do four broad types of efforts. One is to think about what I would call structural economic changes. The switch over from hydrocarbons to green energy would be an example. Another is to think hard about technological advancement, particularly with respect to what are sometimes called advanced and emerging technologies. So, for example, artificial intelligence or quantum computing. The third area is to develop more effective public-private partnerships. Resilience is not just a governmental activity, it's very much a private sector and also societal activity. So how do we create effective public-private partnerships that really can get the job done? And then the fourth, I would say, is we need a new look at globalization, a globalization that takes account not only of economics, but also of security, that looks, very closely at a variety of issues, things like sometimes called friendshoring, that is to say, to make sure that we have the capabilities amongst friendly countries, for example, on information technology, on chips production and the like. So with those four approaches as a general framework, my own view is that with adequate resources, and I think it's important to underline the importance of adequate resources, I think that we can do a good job on resilience, but the job's out there to do. So let me stop there and turn it over to Madeleine.
Thank you, Franklin. You've gone for the global dimension, and I'm going to go for the personal, the human dimension, because the people working within the industry, those who are writing the plans, creating the systems, and those who are developing the new technology are creating systems that perhaps the public, those on the front line, are quite detached from. I'm just thinking about us as we set up for this webinar and making sure that we understood the systems and how it's operating, and we're used to doing that. But what we've seen is that the public, who are the people who actually are paying for this technology, the people who are voting for the governments who are going to be implementing these systems, are those that during COVID and throughout the Ukraine war have been the most vulnerable. They have been the ones who have been targeted. They're the ones whose lives and whose disruption have been the focus of a powerful country who has tried to disrupt it through disinformation, through destroying their access to food, clean water, the things that are the norms of everyday life, by weakening their resilience and their determination to support their independent statehood as Ukraine. Now, so I started looking at who we need to be involved and how we need to do that. And I started with a fantastic book that I do recommend people have a look at, which is called When the Dust Settles by a woman called Lucy Easthope. And she's someone who, when the dust settles in disasters, goes in to tackle them. And what I liked about her approach was it starts with cooperation. And you talked about that importance of cooperation across the Western Democratic Alliance. And yes, that's right. But we must never forget that democratic alliances are top down. And we have to remember that actually, if you're going to have resilience, it has to come really from the bottom up as well. So it's how do we ensure, when we are talking about resilience, we make sure that we don't rob ourselves of the resilience that comes from taking and retaining control of your own life and your own fight back, even when a powerful nation like Russia is doing their best to undermine and destroy your capability to just survive. So I think that one of the things we have to start with is being much more honest and brutally honest with the public, particularly right now, about the level of the threats that we're facing. I hope that somewhere in Sweden someone is doing some research looking at how Sweden's resilience during COVID was impacted by the provision of that leaflet, well, booklet, I suppose, if war or disaster comes. that the Swedish government sent out across the population, and they were thinking more in terms of if they were subject to an attack from Russia, but also preparing people for natural disasters and climate change. And they started by saying, right, this is what you need to do. This is how you have to prepare. This is your responsibility. And this is what the government will be doing. And that basic communication of saying, you have some responsibilities and we'll be coming in probably a little bit later. But they also made sure that they set up stockpiles. They built partnerships. They did the most important of things. They did training sessions that involved local government, regional government, national government, industry, so that there was partnerships and a knowledge, even before anything happened, of who you needed to talk to. Who knows that? And I looked at what happened when Kiev was attacked, and that resilience there, and the knowledge within Kiev of who controlled the watercourses and how important and critical the flooding of key routes into Kiev was. That wasn't a military knowledge, that was a local government knowledge that was critical to making sure that the military invasion couldn't move forward. Now, one of the key things that has been important to Ukrainian resilience and support from the wider world has been the absolute focus and trust in President Zelensky. So leadership, and seeing that this is a man of his word, a man who can be trusted, a man who wants to stay and fight on behalf of its people, has brought hope and trust from across the world to Ukraine. But his capacity to communicate and to send out the key messages have been absolutely critical for Ukrainians and for the rest of the world, and has ensured that when he flies in, as he has recently, into the UK, yeah, we say, yes, we'll be sending you perhaps not the planes that you want right now, but we'll certainly send you missiles while we train your people. Germany, moving from its very nervous position, because there is very little chance of saying no to President Zelensky and to his people. So I think we have to build up in terms of resilience in all of our countries. Who are the people who are going to be the explainers? Who are the communicators that we need to get in front of our public to provide the trust and the faith? And Franklin, you know, the US and the UK, we've had some leadership problems in terms of trust and reliability and public feeling. Yes, that's someone I can get behind. So I think we have to rebuild that trust ourselves. We have to build on it. And we have to show our public that it's not just the people at the top, but all the way down through our systems. Whether it's within industry, whether it's in local government, or for me here in Wales, our devolved government. Because they've been critical to giving people a sense of trust that there are people there working with you. But also it's about values. What are the values that we are going to be building our resilience on? That will say that our response will be at the human level, that we're going to be responding to the impacts of people's lives if things fail, how we are going to help people rebuild their lives, how within chaos we'll ensure food supplies, shelter, water, and water is a big issue in the moment in the UK, Franklin, because the water quality has definitely diminished and people here are very, very angry at the failure to protect the quality of our water supplies. But how do we build into that resilience and awareness of the fact that there'll be people with different needs? You know, there will be elderly people, there will be pregnant women, there'll be people with disabilities, there'll be people who, because of attacks and threats, will have mental health problems. So how are we going to ensure that we reassure our populations that they will be dealt with on a humane and personal level as we all fight back against the threats we feel? Now, I don't know if Dorothy is with us. Ian?
I think we're still trying to contact Dorothy. Sadly, we've no joy yet, but we are. The Solomon Isles is a long way away. In this digital age, we clearly can't reach the Solomon Isles, but hopefully they'll be with us. I think to pick up on the point that you make about trust and values, and I think as we're talking about the focus today, we're looking to, I think, to talk about the digital world. And that for me, you know, as a communicator, I can totally sympathize and endorse entirely what you just said about that trust and communication. So if you haven't got trust, it breaks down entirely. And we've been very lucky, I think, at times of national resilience in both our nations, here and across the pond, that the right cometh the hour, cometh the person that you can believe in and actually has been there, if we look historically, when we really backs against the wall. And I think what you there, for me, pick up on is that it's very easy in this sort of expert to talk about that we forget about the common person and actually how strong their sense of survival is. You know, in our darkest hour, as we sit in London here, it was the common people got together despite the blitz to stick it and maintain it and resilience. And I think that's what perhaps surprised people, what's happening here. But it's not unique. It has happened in other places. But yeah, if I can move to the digital side and back to you, Franklin. You know, for the population, the common people, we don't, even the experts, I would suggest, some of them don't really understand where we're going now. We're into world of AI, with the whole of the digital move. What are we looking to maintain, you know, digital security, and how do we keep, if we take that trust going forward, what do we need to worry about in maintaining digital security?
Right. Well, first of all, I just want to applaud what Madeleine said. I think in full accord, but I couldn't have said it as well. So well done. On the digital side, and there is an individual element here, but I think there are several things we really need to think about from both a national point of view as well as an individual point of view. First, I would say that protecting intellectual property from adversarial intrusions is really tremendously critical. I think we especially are looking at the issues for intellectual property surrounding advanced and emerging technologies. You mentioned artificial intelligence, for example, quantum computing, robotics, biotech. We have seen an enormous amount, particularly of Chinese cyber espionage, and we see that, for example, historically or recently historically, where the Chinese were trying to access the information around the vaccines that were being developed with respect to the pandemic. And we can expect them to do comparable things with respect to all additional innovative technologies. It's a particular problem really for one of the key places that innovation comes from, and that's really small business, small and medium-sized business and academia. They're the heart of innovation in many ways, certainly in the United States, and I think likewise in the UK. But companies that are small businesses really need to focus on their business. They don't really have time to focus on cybersecurity. So how we support them, how do we provide them with cybersecurity capabilities, especially against the determined adversary like China, is an important issue. A second key issue, I think, is to ensure that the critical infrastructures which are necessary for people's lives are up and running. Whether it's energy, we saw in the United States, for example, what was called the Colonial Pipeline attack, brought down the gas pipelines for the good portions of the eastern United States. We saw that, or you saw that, I should say, in UK with the National Health Service down a few years ago because of the so-called NotPetya attack. We've seen governmental functions at the local government level or at school level being affected by ransomware. So all those things, I think, are important to take account of. There is a wartime dimension, or maybe a better way to say it is getting ready for war so we don't have to have a war. And Ukraine is, of course, the example of what can go on under war. At the beginning of the, or even just before the actual attack, the so-called Viasat network was taken down by the Russians. Fortunately, there was an ability to substitute Starlink, but it would have, if Ukraine had not been able to keep its networks up and running, there would have been a great, even more harm to the public, as well as to governmental functions, as well as to their defense capabilities. And the fourth category, I guess I would say, is there's an issue of what I will call cascading attacks, interdependencies. So energy, whether it's a pipeline or the grid, that's dependent on information technology. But information technology is dependent on energy. You know, it can't run the networks without energy. Everything is dependent on water. That already got mentioned by Madeleine. So whether it's, you know, gas or nuclear or whatever, use tremendous amounts of water in order to deal with this. So how to bring together the effective resilience for all of these kinds of topics. And again, I think we can do it, but we haven't done it, is the way I would put it. There's a technical approach. It has a jargony kind of set of words. It's called zero trust architectures. What it really means is that when you have a network, you pay attention to who's on it. Only the right people should be on it. The jargon word is authentication. You make sure that even if it's the right person on it, that they're doing things that they're supposed to be able to do. And again, the jargon word is authorization. You want to make sure that your information is protected, both when it's in a computer or it's moving across the network. So you want everything to be encrypted. You want to pay attention to what's happening on the network, so-called continuous monitoring. And you want to separate out portions of the network. Again, the jargon word is segmentation. So if something happens to one portion of a network, it doesn't affect everything else. To do all that, it's really important, I think, to have the more capable entities, and that will be both governments and significant private companies, help the less capable. The U.S. has just put out a so-called cyber strategy. It has that concept of the more capable helping the less capable. What we really need to recognize is that while individuals can do useful things, they're not supposed to be able to deal with China, right? Most companies cannot deal with Chinese intrusion, but who can? Well, what we've seen, for example, interestingly enough, at least to those of us who hang around these kind of issues, is that while the general thought was that offense beats defense, in Ukraine we've actually seen that defense has been highly effective. And it's been highly effective both because the Ukraine people and the government is quite good, but they've gotten support. They've gotten support from UK government, they've gotten support from the US government, from other governments, and they've most interestingly gotten support from some very significant private companies. So Microsoft, Google, ESET in Slovakia, I believe, Amazon Web Services, a whole variety of efforts. So this public-private set of actions has become enormously important, and we need to think about how to do that in advance. so that people can, apropos Madeline's point, people can trust their networks. People can trust that they can reach the, in your case, the National Health Service, or here in the United States, local government, call the police if they need something, call the fire department if they need something, have those networks up and running. To do that, we need to think what's the appropriate legal framework and who's going to cover the costs. Now, I'm not for sure about this, but my impression is that actually Microsoft and the others in Ukraine are actually doing it for free. Certainly they're doing it for not much money, not for free. But that's not a viable model, for the long term. So we need to think through how to create incentives. Colleagues and I wrote about utilizing work in the United States. Tax credits would be one way. There can be grants. I've talked also about the public-private approach. I think that we need to have companies organize themselves together so that they share information and they share capabilities. In the US, there's a very interesting organization called the Analysis and Research Center for Systemic Risk. It started off as the Financial Services Analysis and Research Center, the big financial companies, and then they added in the big energy companies. And they work on systemic risk to try and make sure that in the event, so to speak, the networks stay up and running. You need, for human beings, they need to be able to have access to food. They need to be able to have access to their monies, banks. They need to be able to have access to government services. And so in this information technology age, keeping things up and running is very critical. And then I, as you already mentioned, have a defense background, so making sure that the critical infrastructures needed for defense would be available in wartime. So we need to do special attention to air, to rail, to ports, to pipelines, to the grid, undersea cables. And there are things that are being done, but there's a lot more to do. So again, let me stop there and see if that is somewhat useful for what you're thinking about.
Thanks, Franklin. It has highlighted what I nearly mentioned at the start. When your opening remarks, it went huge, and I thought I'm never going to maintain this to within an hour. We're all getting some questions in, but that's fascinating. Perhaps, Madeleine, I didn't know if anything you wanted to come in there before we'll move on to shortly to the looking at geopolitics and supply chains. But you basically covered everything there, Franklin, I can certainly think of, in my limited scope. But I wondered, the black elephants, the unknown unknowns, as a certain defense secretary once said. Can you identify cyber black elephants? What do you most think might suddenly appear?
Well, one of the cyber black elephants, and I was really quite shocked about this. I came across at a meeting actually this week, being hosted by Americans, actually. And that was about the people who are actually working in the tech industries. And some of the conversations I had were really quite alarming. And it's about human resources and the failure to attract and retain the right people with the right skills into this world, this digital security world that we're trying to prepare ourselves from. And there was someone who'd been very senior in a major multinational company who talked about how women were very much second class within the working environment, were often very poorly paid. And I see you're nodding away there, Franklin, you recognize what I'm talking about. And that their experience and backgrounds were not being recognized and promoted. A senior woman that I spoke to working in the US government said she'd worked in cybersecurity and digital security fields, and all of the women that she'd worked had all left because it wasn't a working environment that they felt recognized, valued, and sought to retain women. And I thought, good grief, that came as an absolute shock for me, because this is leading edge stuff, and you'd in my mind, I thought they'd be very conscious of HR issues, of issues of equality and diversity. So I had a look at this and saw that actually women are only 36% of the workforce, with a high turnover, many leaving within 10 years. Ethnic minorities provide only, certainly in the UK, 6% of the digital workforce. That's a massive underemployment. 19% of the workforce are dyslexic, and many within the sector are neurodiverse. So how are we going to ensure that the tech sector, within that sort of human resources need, are actually responding to people's needs? And I went back to a session that I did some time ago with a large multinational digital security employer here in Wales. And he was talking about how his approach was very much to be individual focus on the worker. So they went out particularly to recruit people who are neurodiverse, and they would talk to them about what they needed. So it was, in your employment, what will make the workplace more attractive to you? And for some, it was about the equipment they had. For some, it was actually the colour of their workplace. So in their individual office, they needed to have a certain colour scope that made them feel comfortable. But also, what the company had done was to actually set up within the workforce support groups. So there were support groups for people who were also carers. There were support groups for women who were pregnant. There were work groups for people with alcohol problems. So within the workplace, there was a recognition of the background that you were trying to cope with while doing the best you could at work. And what that lesson was we care for you as a person, not just a component within the system. And I think this is really critical to a comment that a man called Graham Wright at Inmarsat said in an earlier Cityforum event, when he said, without the right people, you're less likely to survive. So when you find the right people, it's how do we actually make sure we keep them there? But the other issue in terms of SMEs that I have heard so often is about how we make, Franklin, the big portals, how we get them into the DoD. You know, that can feel like a barrier as an SME. How do you get to talk to them? How do you talk to the MOD? How do we make sure that they aren't put off by the documentation and the procurement steps that they have to go through to be recognised as someone with the capability that could actually change defence? And how do we make sure that innovation and procurement work together at the pace of relevance and need? Because that's something that is a major problem. You know, we're not going to be able to take 10 years to get the new tech in front of our military. We're not going to be able to wait to go through procurement systems that are long, laborious and difficult, but also with SMEs that they actually get access to the finance and to the payment systems that are rapid enough for SMEs to survive and provide us with the capabilities that they are going to be at the cutting edge of actually producing for us. So I hope that answers some of your black elephant questions here.
It does, and what's more to the point, I've started asking a couple of questions. I've been in the panel because I'm getting concerned as the chair that we're cutting into question time, but we already answered one, was about, from Christopher Samuel, about it recognising the front line. So we're not talking about the big picture companies, but as you say, it's the people on the ground that actually deliver these things. And the piece you mentioned, very common, to my heart and background, this SME, they don't have a huge financial background to keep waiting for the MOD process to suddenly give them the money for the contract. They need to be able to get the money in to keep going, or the ID will burn out and go. So this absolutely, and I think picking where Franklin's before with what we've seen in Ukraine is that ability to go very, very fast, very quickly, which I think quite frankly for the UK and the US military is saying, gosh, could we move that fast in adapting and changing that we've seen with the Ukrainians. I'm conscious of time moving on, but perhaps, Franklin, was there anything you wanted to add quickly on the cyber black effort piece before we move on?
I would simply say that we've seen a lot with respect to artificial intelligence, so-called chat GPT, generative large language models, and we're not really clear where those are going. So I'm inclined to let things run and be careful about figuring out what appropriate guardrails to protect individuals are needed. But we're such early days that I think it's, at least I can't tell you where this is going to all end up. So I think it's really quite new news.
I think too, as we move on to the next slide, Peter will take us forward. The bit for me, I think, is this whole business of trust. Who do we trust in an area where we're not sure who actually knows what they're talking about? And I think the trust is going to be hugely vital to move there. Anyway, let's move on to geopolitics and supply chains. And perhaps, Madeleine, come back to you on the commodity supply chains. How do we guarantee this? Or Franklin mentioned it briefly, the friendshoring. How do we maintain resilience in our supply chains?
Well, I think one of the things we have sadly been really pushed in our face in terms of what's happened in Ukraine has been a deliberate attempt to destabilize commodities so that critical grain, sunflower oil, and fertilizer going out across the world from Ukraine has been blocked. So the maritime system of commodity expansion across the world has been threatened in a way that we've not seen for many, many years. So sea lines, communications, pipelines attacked, underwater cables being attacked. These are new dimensions that we're having to tackle for the first time in a long time. So far, we haven't seen any attacks on satellites, but we're very, very aware that that's a system that has been attacked in Ukraine. And there's attempts to destabilize their communication systems. If it hadn't been from help from America in particular, how would Ukraine have been able to maintain its communications? So I think that's something we have to do working together with allies. But I also think we have to take responsibility for making sure it is a message that goes out across the world. Okay, it's Ukraine this time. Where are your vulnerabilities? So countries that perhaps have been holding back on being critical have to start looking inwards and seeing their own threats. We're seeing China, for example, buying up farmland in Africa, because China is already thinking about the global effects of climate change. Much of its farming land is coastal and low-lying. So sea level change has implications that they're aware of, and they're making sure they're securing their food supplies right now. It's a pity that Dorothy isn't with us, because the Solomon Islands, it's a very, very real issue for them. So they're the issues that are concerning me. It's how do we ensure that what we've seen both in Ukraine and that we saw in Syria are not threats that we aren't ready to cope with, and that we haven't really seen since the end of the Second World War?
I think for me that's the thing with Ukraine. It's caused a huge wake up for those, particularly in the, we talk about going back to people at the hard end, those people tasked with resilience and slogging away, getting plans, etc., to which nobody paid any attention, and then suddenly, oh gosh, we better change it. So I think this mindset, the paradigm shift that people are now starting to talk about is great, and thanks to Cityforum for starting this in a wider scale too. Anything you want to add on that side, Franklin, before we start? Better look at some questions very shortly.
What I would just add is that there's some supply chains, like, for example, green hydrogen, where it's mostly dependent on having adequate technological development and adequate resources and good public-private partnerships. But the countries of the transatlantic nations and the West, if you will, can do that. There's some other areas where we're in a more difficult position because we find that China's in control. And that's particularly true with respect to a variety of minerals that are especially needed for green energy transition. So we need to think hard about how we can have adequate mining capabilities, how we can do that in an environmentally appropriate way, and how we can bring those online promptly. And again, without getting into long studies and even more jargon that I've already made you suffer with, it's not going to be easy to resolve the dependencies that China has managed to create, but I think it's really extremely important, particularly, as I said, with respect to a variety of mineral processing and the like for the green energy area.
Thank you. Now I'll jump to some questions. Madeleine, what possible action can be taken to stop the disintegration of Arctic sea ice and melting tundra? It's ignored in government climate action plans. That's from Andrew Ross.
Wow, that's beyond my pay grade and my intellectual capability. To be honest, this has been an area that has long been of interest to me. And in Tasmania, seeing some of the research that was going in when they were digging down into the ice and coming back up with these samples and breaking down, and it was a prime example of why we've got climate change, because you could see the carbon increasing across the ice. You could see the chemical pollutions increasing across the ice. The problem is, I don't know that governments are willing to tell their publics enough about how high the level of risk is. You know, in Iran alone, 63% of the dams are empty. I think that our future is about water and food wars and migration if we're not careful. So we have to start being brutally honest about the risks that we're facing and the measures that we're going to have to take. And I'm afraid that's as far as my technical expertise can take me.
I think just before I take another question, I'll put this one to Franklin. This is from Malcolm Wall. How do we work up populations to improve self-resilience and collective resilience in the face of modern day threat? I think Madeleine's mentioned this earlier, but as a political advice, how do we work up populations?
One of the things that's happening in the United States is that weather events have become increasingly a problem, whether it's tornadoes, hurricanes, droughts, too much rain, too little rain, etc. I actually have a great faith in the collective wisdom of the American people, in the overall. I would say the same about people in the UK. That doesn't mean that we're not going to have significant disputes. But for example, it seems to me, and maybe this is just me being too optimistic, Whereas about 10 years ago, there was a great deal of denial with respect to climate change. Now it's generally accepted as occurring, but the question is, how do you deal with it? So we moved ahead. There's a leadership factor. Madeleine's underscored that, but it's not just a leadership in Washington, in U.S. terms, from Washington. It's a leadership across the board. So that's teachers, that's religious leaders, that's business people, and that's my mother used to be a Girl Scout leader. That's Girl Scout leaders. We need to have a collective conversation that allows us to deal with these issues. That's not as easy as it looks in the United States. You've obliquely referenced some of the issues that we have faced and do face, but I have a lot of friends across the aisle, so to speak, and while we often disagree, we do talk. So the trick, I think, is to keep the talking going.
Yes, I think that's what I think Madeleine mentioned too with the Swedish system. It's informed communication and giving trust to people and telling them what you know and also what you don't know. I think that's also often neglected on that side. I'm going to jump to another question here for you again, Frank. You picked out China, particularly in your opening remarks. Can you compare the threats from China and Russia, particularly given that Russia also conducts considerable online disinformation activities and is much more openly hostile? That's from Rob Wortham.
Right. Well, a very sensible question. I would say that there are two different kinds of threats. Russia is essentially a disruptor. I mean, it understates, of course, what's happened in Ukraine to just call that disruption. But Russia is not a significant economic threat to whether it's UK, United States, France, European Union countries, Japan, and the like. But it does have disruptive capabilities. It's obviously been willing to go to war, and as the questioner mentioned, it does use information operations. Certainly here in the United States, for example, in the 2016 election, it tried it. It's tried it elsewhere, in Spain, UK, France, and others. China is a much more significant long-term threat, and that's fundamentally because it's an economic threat with high technological capabilities. China subsidizes all of its companies in one way or another, and a good example of the problem comes about the so-called 5G area. It has to do with advanced information technology networks. The Chinese company that leads that is called Huawei, and Huawei, one of its competitors, is a company Ericsson. Well, when Huawei and Ericsson were in competition for the Netherlands networks, Huawei undercut Ericsson by 50 to 60%. They weren't 50 to 60% cheaper, they were 50 to 60% subsidized. So how to deal with that with respect to a market economy, what should we do about that to protect ourselves, I think becomes tremendously important. And that's right across the board. Right now, China, for example, electric vehicle batteries for electric vehicles is really a world leader. That's on us that we have to get ahead. But we need to make sure that we have battery capabilities that are not entirely dependent on China. And we need to do that in such a way that our companies can make money. Now, there are a lot of subsidies that have been offered up, for example, CHIPS, United States CHIPS Act, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which has pretty much nothing to do with inflation reduction, but a lot to do with climate, has lots of subsidies that raised a lot of issues, of course, in Europe. But I think now what we're seeing is that in order to compete effectively with China, we need to incentivize our companies. And one way to do that in the leading areas is to utilize subsidies to get things started, to ensure that we do have the onshoring, friendshoring, comparable set of approaches. So I think there's a lot to be done, but the challenge that China presents is most importantly in the economic area, if we can avoid, of course, a fight over Taiwan, whereas Russia is much more of, if you will, a disruptor and military challenge.
Thank you. I'm going to take a slightly sideways note and thank Hugh for his comment that there's been a 7.7 earthquake around the New Caledonia region. So I hope that Dorothy is okay, but that may explain why she's not able to. Now, jumping backwards to Malcolm, another question, Malcolm Moore. The maritime sector carries the major burden of supply chain activity. Over 80% of the volume of international trade, as we know, and the percentage is even higher in most developing countries. Yet resilience against physical attacks by maritime pirates, as an example, or more broadly, cyber attacks at sea, such as GNSS spoofing, is weak and not especially joined up. What should be done about it? Who wants to take that question?
Well,
Madeleine.
there's two sides and two responsibilities always here. And businesses don't always like governments telling them what to do and saying, you have to install this system, you need to spend more on this. That's not how it works in a capitalist system. I'm sure that within China, the ships are told, you will not allow this to happen. At the end of the day, the decision can be made, as was made by pirates, as ships were heading into the Suez Canal. Djibouti was given additional resources and helped us to work with tackling the pirates issue there. And we've looked at the pirates issue equally off the west coast of Africa. But ultimately, it has to be a cooperation between government and security forces about how we will work together on this. And we're very fortunate in that we have very good cooperation systems. In Europe, we have the European Union. Sadly, Britain made, for me, the wrong decision to come out of that. But we will have to go back into working more collaboratively there. And in the US, you've got very close cooperation between North American neighbors. So business and global leadership networking will come together, whether it is the EU, whether it's NATO, whether it's the UN. We will have to find some ways of tackling the threats that keeps that commodity supply moving and doesn't actually create bigger threats, which we're already seeing with major migration movements of people because of war, famine, and people moving for safety into countries that can't sustain the movements of people in a way that treats them in a humane way. So I'm afraid not a very positive response there, Alan. Ian.
And from the chair, not a very positive response to me because I'm watching the clock ticking by. I think I'm allowed to go over a couple of minutes and one takeaway summary. So I think I'm now being asked for your summary on that. My apologies to those whose questions I didn't get to. I think we covered most of the areas there in a very wide range of discussion. So Franklin, perhaps, how would you sum up in a minute if possible?
Where I would sum up is to say that resilience is quite possible. It needs to be done at all levels. I don't want to steal Madeleine's thunder, but her point about individuals it cannot be overstated. It's as important as anything. At the same time, governments and businesses likewise have to be engaged. And going back to the last questioner and the notion of how to put obligations on businesses, the key, I think, is level playing field. That is to say, as long as there's a level playing field between and amongst competitors, then it will work reasonably well. Lastly, I would say this will not be free. So resources will have to be applied. And we have to ensure that the costs are understood, and that the people, going back to Madeline's point again, trust the government to utilize and expend those resources in a productive way. And let me stop there.
Thank you for being so brief. Madeleine, in a minute or less.
Ingenuity, human ingenuity, has to be given the opportunity to thrive. We have wasted so much ingenuity because the money hasn't been there, the support hasn't been there, and people haven't known how to get through portals and how to expand. And I'll give you a small example. I lost the Ford factory here in Bridgend, fantastic place of ingenuity. And they developed a bacteria working with local universities that would take the wastewater from the making of cars, which included metal and pollutants. And this bacteria ate the metal and the pollutants so that the resulting water could go back into the water system. Now, how's that for human ingenuity, finding a bacteria that can do that? We ought to be celebrating it and actually ensuring that where we have ingenious solutions, they are grabbed by the business community, by universities, by governments, and brought to the benefit of us all.
Thank you. And thank you for finishing on such a positive note. And from the chair, I can just say to people that we will send the panel all the audience questions after the webinar, so you may get an answer after that. So thank you for engaging for the questions. And just before I thank you all for attending, there's one other person I wish to thank, who after 300 sessions and over 3 years is now moving on. So this is the man behind the camera, Peter's last webinar. So I'd like to thank ZJ and to say thank you to Peter for all his expertise in making it run so smoothly and keeping him as well as best he could with a wayward chairman at the time. So thank you all. And we'll look forward to the next one, as I say, on the 12th of June. It's looking at infrastructure. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.